Dr. Graham Gudgin is an associate at the Centre for Business Research at the Judge Business School, University of Cambridge, and co-editor of the very lively site called Briefings for Brexit. He was Special Advisor to the First Minister in Northern Ireland from 1998 to 2002. And so I think he can draw quite a lot from his experiences, and look forward to hearing his view as to how things are going and how we can put some zip into this campaign.
I'm sure your campaign's got tons of zip, but thank you very much for that kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I've very much enjoyed the papers so far today. You mentioned my time in a long career. I spent 4 years as Special Advisor to the First Minister in Northern Ireland, and at one time I knew the Good Friday Agreement off by heart. I think I've forgotten bits of it now. But I wasn't proposing to talk much about the Northern Ireland border today, but it has been mentioned several times during the session, so I'll be happy to take questions on that. Perhaps all I should say here is that I regard the border issue as hugely exaggerated as a problem. It's a soluble problem with a modicum of cooperation, particularly between the Irish and Northern Irish governments. One thing that isn't well known, I perhaps should just mention in case we don't get back to it, is there was a very significant hardening of Irish policy on the border when the current Prime Minister Leo Varadkar took over last June. Before that, there was plenty of cooperation going on. There was meetings between civil servants, north and south. He stopped all of that. And the policy since has been to try and force, if they couldn't force the UK to stay in the customs union, they would at least try and force Northern Ireland to stay in it, and that's currently EU policy. It's worth looking at the withdrawal agreement, by the way. It's very stark on this. I mean, newspapers called it an attempt to annex Northern Ireland, and it's not actually very much short of that. And surprise, surprise, Dublin ends up with a policy which aims at easing Northern Ireland into a at least semi-detached position with in the UK. But that's all I'll say about that at this point. Thanks for mentioning the website, Briefings for Brexit. If you haven't looked at it, I hope you will. It's briefingsforbrexit, all one word, .com. Myself and Professor Robert Toombs at Cambridge started this. Robert Toombs is the author of a terrific book called The English and Their History, which I warmly recommend to you. It's for your holiday. It's only about 600 pages long, but it's good holiday reading. Terrific book. We started this website to counter something which I know gets up all of your noses, and that's the idea that anyone with half a brain cell has to support Remain. Given people believe that, they may be surprised at how you managed to find your way here today, but we knew that wasn't true. We knew there were plenty of senior academics and Oxford professors and others who supported Brexit and had plenty of intelligent things to say about it. But again, surprise, surprise, weren't getting much coverage in the media. So we felt we should start a website, and we did that. I think we've met our first objective very well. Tons of publicity, something like 100,000 hits in the first few weeks on the website. So I think we fulfilled the intention of showing that there are plenty of highly expert people across the country, not all academics, but mainly academics, who do support Brexit and have got very strong, well-evidenced reasons for doing so. My own, I suppose I had to start with a mea culpa in a way, or that I was one of those, and there may be others among you in the audience who voted to remain in the EU in the 1975 referendum. I was a young 20-something. I'd got much better things to do than read the Treaty of Rome, I'm afraid. So I didn't really notice, and Ted Heath was at pains not to point out to me that the Treaty of Rome talked about ever closer union. None of us, I think, knew much about that. I voted to join a free trade agreement. And I think I can claim a degree of consistency. I'm still in favour of a free trade agreement with the EU. I just want us to be outside the EU and have a trade agreement with them. Like everyone else, I mean, part of my career was evaluating EU expenditure on regional development grants. The more, and indeed working on a number of research projects with other, funded by the EU, with other Europeans, but the more I had to do with the EU at close quarters, the less happy I was about it. It clearly wasn't up to the standards of the British civil servants and expenditure control. And working in Northern Ireland, I became less and less happy. I think the peace fund, the famous peace funds that the EU is so proud of in Northern Ireland was the last straw for me. I mean, that really was just throwing money at a problem, saying, look, here's some money, you know, think of something to spend it on. When Jacques Delors was originally asked by journalists, okay, you've earmarked this money for Northern Ireland, why have you done that? What's it to be spent on? He had to turn to one of his aides at the side and say, well, you know, whisper sotto voce, what is it we wanted to spend it on? And the answer came back, peace walls. And that was met with derision in Northern Ireland, of course, you know, but he couldn't think of anything else on the spot. And they hadn't thought of anything. It was just it was an expansive gesture. Here's the great EU, you know, they give money to deserving causes. And they've always regarded Northern Ireland as a deserving cause in a very, what always seemed to me, a very patronising way. My other reasons, I think, for becoming more and more Eurosceptic over the years were the obvious ones that I guess most of you share. That it was obvious that this organisation is heading towards the United States of Europe. Slowly, probably take another few decades to get there. But this may be our last chance to get out. And I've always been very taken with the observation that it's not possible to get out of the United States of America. The United States of America started as what it says on the tin. It was a confederation of states. And until the Civil War, it was always referred to in the plural. The United States of America are doing this. After the Civil War, it was referred to in the singular. The United States, as we do now, the United States is bombing Libya. We don't say the United States are bombing Libya. I read today that something like a quarter of electors in Texas would like to secede from the Union. But there's no mechanism for doing that anymore. You can't get out of the United States even if you want to. The relevance of that for us is that I think if we were stayed in the EU for another couple of decades, we would probably find it impossible to get out as well. Especially if they have an army, then things rather change, you know, as they did in the American Civil War. So this is perhaps our last chance to get out, and a good time to get out, really. One point to make here is that at current rates of growth, one single Commonwealth country, India, will probably have as large a market as the whole European Union within 3 decades. So, as I think one of the Roman emperors said, face the rising sun. You know, that's where the future is. And maybe somewhat disruptive to get out. But the whole experience of getting out, the whole difficulty, I think, of getting out of the EU, I think has persuaded many of us to realise why we wanted to get out in the first place. You know, these people just make difficulties where there shouldn't be any. Let me come on to some of the harder things now. I've got nothing to say about fish, by the way, cod or haddock or anything else. But I'm an economist, so I want to take up some of the harder issues in and around economics, starting with migration. As we all know, that was one of the key reasons why so many of the 17.4 million people voted for Brexit. And many prominent Remainers, including most economists, I think, dismiss this as xenophobia or even racism. And even the Labour Party undergoes somersaults on this because they know that actually most of their voters, or a very large proportion of their voters, oppose mass immigration. Now, I happen to agree that mass immigration is an important reason for supporting Brexit. If we're going to get control of our borders in a very real sense is an important part of that. In a nutshell, it seems to me that the UK has an unsustainable business model which relies on mass immigration to fuel growth. And here's the extent to which that's true. Over the last 15 years, we've created 4 million new jobs in the UK, much better than most other countries, or much larger than most other countries. But 3/4 of those jobs have gone to people born outside the UK. So the question for the UK is, why in a heavily populated, densely populated country, why are we expanding our population and employment so rapidly, mainly for people born abroad? Why are we bringing people here to pick leeks? Why don't we allow them to pick leeks in Poland or Lithuania and buy the leeks from them? We're becoming dependent on foreign-born labour in the NHS, in care homes, in hotels, restaurants and other services, but at the cost of great pressure on, particularly on health and education, but also, and this is something which I think receives far too little attention, also on housing. If you bring 4 million people into the country, as we consultants sometimes say, it's a no-brainer to say that those people need somewhere to live. Actually, the number of houses they need at the rates we've seen is about 150,000 houses a year. And how many houses have we been building in the UK over recent years? Well, about 150,000. There you are. So why has it become difficult for our young people to afford houses? Of course, the immigrants themselves can't usually get mortgages. I mean, their houses are actually bought by buy-to-let landlords, but they're outbidding young people in the housing market and keeping the prices much higher than they should be. I think there's a conflict of interest here between companies, and one should add, in the sense of honesty, also the shareholders of those companies, on the one hand, and the wider population on the other hand. Companies are able to get well-educated and well-motivated workers from Eastern Europe and save on the cost of training them. So the training budget of British firms has halved, I think, over something like the last decade. So this, to me, isn't a sustainable or sensible way of running a country. We've failed to train our own people. We don't train enough doctors. We don't train enough nurses. My own daughter worked in a hospital near Cambridge. They were short of nurses. What did they do? They got an employment agency to go to Portugal and come back with 100 nurses. 50 of them promptly left because actually this was in King's Lynn up on the Welsh, but promptly left because actually they wanted to be in London. They didn't want to be in King's Lynn, but anyway, that's an aside. At the same time as this was going on, the nursing degree course in Anglia Ruskin University in Cambridge was 10 times oversubscribed. Massive numbers of British people trying to get into jobs like nursing couldn't do it because there weren't enough places. So we need to change the UK business plan, in my view, to something more sustainable, with more training and less pressure on public services and housing, and less pressure on well-loved features of British life, like our planning controls. You see, I keep read the Financial Times, the Times. You keep seeing every few days people say, "Oh, we should get rid of our planning laws. You know, let's build over the country. You know, build." Well, many of us don't want that, and to avoid that, we need to get control over migration. Second economic point I want to make. This is one that appeared in the Financial Times. I don't know if many of you read the Financial Times. I do it as a kind of punishment or a self-flagellation, but because I'm an economist, I feel I ought to. Particularly during the referendum campaign, you could see on almost any day of the week the claim that UK's membership of the EU has been good for the UK's membership of the EU has been good for the UK economy. Well, I want to present you with two numbers, okay, and those two numbers are 2.9 and 1.7. Okay, those haven't quite got the resonance of 1066 or 1940, but I want you to remember them anyway. 2.9 was the annual growth rate in per capita GDP in the UK in the 2.5 decades before we joined the EU. So really from the end of the war up until 1973, 2.9%. And what's been the growth in per capita GDP? Per capita GDP, by the way, is a standard measure of living standards. It's the amount of money we have to share between us, amount of income. 2.9% per annum before we joined. So what's been the growth rate since we joined in the 44 years? 1.7. Yeah, there you are. What an audience. Plenty of brain cells here. There we are. Even if you leave out the dismal last 10 years since the banking collapse, the rate of growth was much better before we joined. By the way, if you tried to send a letter or an article to the Financial Times pointing this out, it would never got published. By the way, didn't want to know that. And by the way, just to understand what these numbers mean, at 2.9% per annum, you increase your living standards over 44 years, the period we've been in the EU, 3.5 times. You'd be 3.5 times richer. At 1.7, you're only twice as rich. So it's a really big difference, growing at one rate rather than the other. Now, what economists say is, yes, but there's lots of other things changed since 1973. You know, we've had oil crises, we've had this and that. You know, the world growth rate has slowed a bit. So that slowdown may not be due to the EU itself. Well, I think the best way of sorting this out is to take the US as a benchmark. And the US didn't join the EU, of course, and unlikely to. But it's been affected by oil price changes and many other things that have happened in the world. So how do we compare with the US, looking over the whole post-war period? And the answer is our living standards have been very close to 3/4 of those in the US, right the way through. Don't vary very much at all. And if you try and look for a change before and after we joined the EU, say, well, surely we should have improved a bit relative to the US after we joined. It's not there. There's no change at all. So the conclusion, the fair conclusion to draw from this is that probably as a best estimate, joining the EU made no difference at all to UK living standards. You know, if anything, perhaps a bit worse, but let's be charitable and just say no difference. We then have to ask, does the reverse hold? If it didn't help us joining, will it damage us leaving? And we can't say with certainty, I think, but my view is yes. As a first approximation, you probably won't notice very much difference right through 1920, you know, right through the next decade. Admittedly, people of my age may not be here long enough to observe exactly what happens here, but that's my expectation. Now, an interesting thing here, maybe of more interest to me than to you, but is, I think, really quite important for the running of a modern democracy like the UK, is that the great proportion of economists disagree with this. They think the EU has been good for the UK economy. And nearly all the big forecasting bodies, the Treasury, the OECD, the IMF, the Bank of England, great majority of academic forecasters, all said that, as you know, I think, that leaving the EU, even announcing that we were going to leave the EU, would greatly damage the UK economy. I can think of no equivalent situation in my lifetime in which the weight of professional opinion was so consistent in one direction and yet so completely ignored. My wife, who's sitting in the back, she'll tell me if I'm wrong on this. But there was a week in which I think the Treasury, the OECD, IMF, all issued reports, and they all said, look, this would be a big loss to the UK economy. My wife turned to me and said, look, Brexit can't win now. You know, the whole world, weight of opinion is against us. But as we know, the referendum was won, and it was won because most people said, we don't actually believe these people, we don't want to know. And Michael Gove, bless his heart, said that we shouldn't listen to predictions from what he called organisations with acronyms, by which he meant Treasury, OECD, IMF, etc. He later explained that what he meant by that was that you shouldn't just take what these organisations say purely based on their reputation or prestige. You should try and understand what it's actually based on, what the predictions are based on. And very few economists have done that. But I suppose because I was, by that point, a dyed-in-the-wool Brexiteer, who was rather suspicious of these forecasts, with colleagues at Cambridge and some in Ulster University in Northern Ireland. All of our research team, except me, by the way, were Remain voters and still Remain voters. So it wasn't a sort of ideological thing. But we fully replicated what the Treasury had done, and we looked very, very carefully at what OECD and others had done. To cut a long story short, we found the Treasury work deeply flawed, and always, you'll be shocked by this, shocked. The flaws were always in one direction. So we investigated, we found out what the flaws were. By the way, we needed 1 million pieces of trade data to do this. It took months of work, without any EU grants, I have to say, to do it. But we did it. We found the flaws. The Treasury then refused to meet us to discuss any of this. They also, by the way, refused to meet Peter Lilly, who'd done not such academic work, but done a very creditable piece of work on the Treasury report. Treasury produced 2 reports, by the way, about 300 pages altogether during the referendum campaign on the short-term and long-term impacts. In the short term, they said there would be immediate year-long recession and an increase of 500,000 in unemployment, which, well, I may have missed something in the press, but as far as we know, absolutely hasn't happened. And once again, I think their reputation is in tatters. I mean, they've disgraced themselves in this matter. But their long-term forecasts that we'd lose up to 7% of GDP by 2030 by leaving the EU is still there on the table. And I think this must be influencing the UK's negotiating position. So even though the Treasury is discredited among many of us, it's still there sitting on the table, backed by lots of other organisations saying, well, if you do leave, it'll be very bad for the EU, very bad for the UK. One thing you find if you talk to academics and politicians on the continent is that they all believe this, they know this. They say, well, why are you doing this? It's going to be bad for you. So it's very important to know that this work is deeply flawed. If you've got another couple of hours and nothing much to do now, I'll explain to you exactly why it's flawed and exactly what they did wrong. But if you're willing to take it from me, we did this very carefully. They were wrong. I'll just mention one thing they did wrong. They had to estimate how much extra trade you do with the EU through being a member of the EU. And they looked at lots of trade data to try and work that out. But what they did was they took an average across all 28 EU countries. What's on average, how much do these countries gain through being members of the EU? When we looked at that, we saw that the UK was very different. In fact, the UK is virtually the only country in the entire European Union which does more trade outside Europe than it does inside. Quite a few countries in Europe do almost 90% of their trade inside Europe. So we're very different. But the Treasury didn't recognise that. They didn't look at the UK specifically. And we thought that was perhaps just an oversight, OK, George Osborne was their minister. Perhaps they didn't want to push this too much. But then we were sent a report which was obtained under a Freedom of Information request, which showed that they did know this. They did know that if you looked at the UK, the answer was a very much smaller gain in trade. And therefore, even if you lost all that trade, you were losing much less. And they just hadn't, well, what should we say? Should we kind of say they'd forgotten? What we do know is that the chief economist in the Treasury, who, by the way, was given a knighthood shortly before he wrote this report and has now been promoted to Deputy Governor of the Bank of England. So that's how our civil service tends to work. He was responsible for these reports, but we do know that he was in the Treasury at the time that the earlier report was done. So to be serious about this, they did know about this, and they just thought it was perhaps better not to mention it. There we are. Now, my belief is, I perhaps rather more optimistic than some of the earlier speakers, but that may be because I'm not a fisherman, but in general, I'm more optimistic. because I assume that there definitely will be a free trade agreement. We will end up with free trade. The EU are trying to sort of punish us and treat us as whipping boys by we're now almost 2 years since the referendum. We haven't actually started these trade talks yet. But I think we will end up with a free trade agreement. By the way, this will be the world's first free trade agreement between two bodies that already have free trade. As people keep telling us, it's going to take 7 years to to go from one to the other. You know, 7 weeks should do it. But even with free trade, companies do end up with higher costs. That there will be more administration. You won't be able to just drive lorries straight into France anymore. You will have to declare what's in your lorry. Your lorry may be stopped and searched and so on. But this is where someone like John Mills comes in, and I'm glad to see John's name mentioned several times this morning, because John's got something that all the economists in the world haven't got. He's got direct experience of trading. His £100 million company trades across about 85 different countries. And he says the trading consumer goods, as you know, not being a shopper, I'd never heard of JML, but my wife said, oh, you must know JML. Consumer goods. But John says that the costs are relatively trivial. You know, you have to set up the cross-border administration once, but then once you've done it, it's just a matter of pressing a button on the computer. Very relevant for the Northern Ireland border, by the way. I was also in Port of Bristol last week, and I asked where the customs shed was. Sorry, there is no customs shed. The customs shed is a computer. This is all now done on computer all over the world. And I said, well, what about searches? So, well, over the last 2 years, we've only had 4 containers searched, and the searches are only done on intelligence. So if they think there's drugs coming in, they get some intelligence, they'll go and try and open a container. And that, again, is very relevant for the Northern Ireland border. If the only trucks you're going to stop are those you have intelligence on, you don't actually need to stop them on the border. You can stop them anywhere. Once you know what it is you're trying to stop. There may be additional difficulties for financial services if these aren't included in the free trade agreement, as we know, but preparations are being made by city firms. And the preparations made already suggest to me that this is probably quite a manageable problem. A few thousand jobs may be moved, but in the banking collapse, they lost 50,000 jobs in a year. By the way, that's this sort of comparison in this. For most exports, especially in engineering, where tariffs are very low, about 2%. And by the way, we've had something like a 10 to 15% depreciation of sterling, so a 2% tariff is small beer compared to that. Even in motor vehicle production, where tariffs are higher at 10%, the evidence is that producers aren't overly concerned because sterling is now at a much more competitive level post-Brexit. The major investment announcements from Nissan, BMW, Toyota, and most recently Vauxhall all fly in the face of warnings from economists. These are all major companies facing a significant tariff if we don't have a free trade agreement. They all seem to have confidence that we will have a free trade agreement and they'll be able to compete fine. By the way, for those in earlier talks, I think who were understandably suspicious of Theresa May and the Tory government, and I'm not a traditional Tory voter, so I'm not making a party political point here. But it seems to me those announcements are very significant. This is saving thousands of jobs in places like Sunderland and Derby. And the government's policy, I think, in doing that is a considerable success. Okay, the fishing industry may have the problems that we heard about earlier, but rather big job creators are investing and saving large numbers of jobs. One of the reasons, the reason for the timing, the week in which we set up the briefings for Brexit website, by the way, was one of those terrible weeks in which Mrs. Theresa May wasn't going to last till tea time, and Parliament was going to vote down Brexit, and we, you know, at the very least, we'd have a second referendum if we were lucky. But so we thought we really ought to get on with this. You know, if there was a possibility that the government would fall, and we would have a second referendum, we need to be much better organised as academics than we were last time. So that was the timing of it. But since then, I've become less concerned. I mean, it seems to me every few weeks, Theresa May's come in for what must feel to her like an artillery barrage, you know, with all the press saying this is terrible, she's useless, and she won't last. But what you notice is when the smoke clears, Theresa May is still there, and we're still going to leave the single market, we're still going to leave the customs union. When you've gone through about 3 iterations of that, I think, to me anyway, I start to build up confidence that that's where we're going to go. There will be lots of worries and fretting along the way, but that's where we'll end up. We do our own forecasts here. We think that GDP into the next decade may be about 1.5% lower than it otherwise would have been, but largely because migration will have been controlled. With less people, you have less jobs and less activity. But the living standards of those living in the UK, that's us, should be largely unaffected. So we won't, our prediction is we really won't notice very much difference here. We've done all this work. I think it's utterly scandalous, and there are professors in Cambridge who very much agree with us on this, that our critiques has been almost entirely ignored by the BBC, The Guardian, The Independent, and of course our wonderful friends, the Financial Times. You can also wonder why the Treasury Select Committee hasn't cross-questioned the Treasury on any of this. I mean, we've given them chapter and verse on exactly what the Treasury did wrong, and they don't seem to be interested. I don't know if any of you know Tory MPs, so I'll dismiss the Labour ones. Won't embarrass them on this, but if you know Tory MPs who are on the Treasury Select Committee, you might just ask them why that is. So, in conclusion, our conclusion is that there may be some costs to Brexit due to disruption in trade, but we expect these to be minor. It may well take a long time to put in place a replacement set of free trade agreements. It may take a couple of decades, but eventually this will happen. And even while it is happening, we won't notice very much in terms of loss of income. Overall, my expectation is that things will be reasonably normal. We will have somewhat more control over our economy. We won't have total control because we'll be part of global agreements. Not all our agreements are with the EU. I don't expect a bonfire of regulations. We value our consumer food standards and environmental protection, and we're rather unlikely to scrap many of these, in my view. Nor, in my view, should we weaken labour regulations. I don't think we'd want to. The growth of income inequality suggests that our regulations, governing trade unions and others, are probably too weak already. But with more control over migration, we can attempt to move back towards the property-owning democracy that Mrs. Thatcher applauded, and one in which everyone has a skill which is saleable in the labour market. In other words, we'll have a chance to move towards a more balanced and more equal society. But whether, in fact, we do achieve this will, of course, be up to us and not up to someone else. So I hope we make the best of it. Thank you very much.